you're kind of an unconventional diplomat, right? I think you came into this role as maybe an unconventional USAID administrator in a way. Um, and you came in not wanting to be a caretaker, like you really wanted to shake things up. I remember that I think you'd only been in the role 6 months and you already gave that big speech at Georgetown with a big new vision, right? Progress, not programs. So, I mean, I know you're probably haven't had time to reflect much yet. You're at the end of this very intense period in this role, but you look back on what you were trying to accomplish. How do you feel about where you've come?
I feel good. I luckily had been in government, in the executive branch, proximate to USAID for 8 years before. So I was not naive about the speed with which, some of the internal things could change, but all of our cues for how of what USAID does have come from our people around the world.
Sure.
And of course, echoed by, folks who write for Devex or who work for NGOs that think full time about how assistance should be done differently. So, you know, we are very, we are part of a community. We are not agents of our entire destiny here at USAID in terms of congressional directives and earmarks, in terms of how certain rules and regulations that apply to the entire federal government apply here, blah blah blah. So trimming and axing bureaucracy that interferes with USAID's ability to be as quick as we need to be is something that every administrator has taken on and will continue to take on. And it requires constituency building and partnership because, again, a lot of it isn't of our own making. It's in the interest of also being faithful stewards of taxpayer money. So I'd say we've slashed 4 million hours of burdensome red tape internally for our people. We've lowered the barriers for entry, for local partners and for the private sector and others. We've got catalytic funds now that allow us to de-risk, to bring more private sector partners in. I think the amount of private sector contribution to USAID's development endeavors is up by 40% or something just in the last couple of years. That should go up and up and up. I imagine the next administration will embrace, or I hope they will embrace that agenda. And then the workforce, we've had a major push on empowering our foreign service nationals who are known, outside of USAID as our local staff. And that is really USAID's superpower and kind of, not actually talked about much in thought circles here in Washington. But, these are the engineers and the economists who work at USAID for 5, 10, 30. I met somebody a few weeks ago in Peru who'd worked for USAID for 50 years.
Wow.
And they know everyone, and they are the technical professionals who, of course, work with our foreign service officers and others. And I think we've made the most concerted push to empower them, to give them career paths, more access to training. That's going to have a lasting impact on how far U.S. taxpayer dollars go in terms of achieving, development outcomes. So there's lots to say about the how, and you're a unique audience and probably caring a lot about the how. The localization target, as it was for Raj before me, is really a hard one to meet. It consumes a lot of staff time. But the rule changes that we have achieved, in addition to already having, doubled the amount of assistance going to local partners since we've been here, I'm hoping that there's going to be that's where we are now at roughly 12% is like a lagging indicator a little bit, because the way money moves through the US government system, again, is not fast. So you should start to see those numbers tick up, in the next year and the year after. And the rule changes, lowering the barriers to entry for local partners, should pay dividends again for generations hence. And I can't imagine anyone coming along and saying, "Oh no, let's make it harder to work with USAID." So hopefully that trend line will continue. But we're a long way from the 25% target that I set out in the Georgetown speech.
I mean,
Having
that's sort
said
of
all
the,
that, if I just say one last thing, that's the how. I think where most non-Devex maybe, sort of consumers of USAID and development in our efforts, look at the what and how we showed up, for people in need and what development outcomes are happening out in the world. So I'm sure we'll talk about that as well.
No, we should. I almost think like by putting a target on localization, of course, it's natural, but that's where everyone's focus and attention has gone. I think you mentioned 12%. You're about to release those numbers formally, I think, in the coming days that show, there has been progress, but like you're saying, it's far off of what the target you set is. But it's interesting listening to the way you frame your efforts there. It's much broader, and in some ways much more fundamental than just localization.
Well,
And I
for
kind
sure.
of wonder if localization itself ended up distracting a bit from this broader vision of change that you've had, because it is much more than just that, I
It
think,
may
right?
it, it may have distracted people who focus on localization, but it certainly didn't distract us. I mean, we have teams that are working on each of our reform lines of effort, and they are accountable for a set of objectives. I am accountable for a set of objectives, under each of those rubrics. So you mentioned it's actually progress beyond programs. It's not progress, not
That's
programs, because programs are foundational, of course,
right.
to what USA does, not least because they help us mobilize other partners. They allow us to have some skin in the game on various initiatives. But we see the ways in which our workforce is less able to be out in the field and out in the world because they're too busy filling out forms and chained to their desks with bureaucratic requirements. So our effort to slash administrative and reporting requirements and burdens internally, that was a whole line of effort. We now, over the last year, have shifted to the external burdens that make it hard, particularly for first-time partners or for local organizations, or even for the private sector, actually, to work with USAID. So that's the next phase. But burden reduction has been all guns blazing. Each of USAID's multiple hiring authorities have their own issues and have needed and came to me asking for modernization and different forms of empowerment. And we just in the course of the last couple of days finally got pay parity of sorts for overseas personal service contractors who make up the lion's share of our humanitarian professionals who go into the most dangerous places, many of our global health professionals as well. And then, of course, our foreign service and civil service modernization efforts, like those continue. Their teams of people, they come to me, report to me. So those are just, a few examples. I think localization is something there's a community of people who care about and are really in the details of that. And they also, and I think maybe this is what your question is getting at, see it as a proxy for a kind of different spirit of interaction.
Right.
And there's a kind of gestalt to the effort that is really about respect and partnership and deference to those who know best. And, we could have said all those things and had all those, high-minded principles. Certainly, it's the ethos that and the humility that I would try to bring to my work and have tried throughout my career. But without the targets, it'd be very hard to hold missions accountable, to hold bureaus accountable, and so forth. So you're probably right that some have gone there, but that's why we've been out over the last weeks, really trying to make sure the full scope of the reform agenda under the how is well understood, and the what in the world is out there for the world to see. But again, I think lifting up, some of the examples where USAID has made flagship contributions, like in Ukraine, that's an important part of these last months, is to make sure that that doesn't go unnoticed, so that it can be scaled and replicated by future teams.
Yeah, I get the sense that, you're not trying to create a lot of USAID contractors that happen to be local. That you really wanted to do something more fundamental than the project-based approach that we're still somewhat stuck with. I know you said to Mike Froman at the Council on Foreign Relations recently, like we need to completely change, we need to change our approach altogether, was the way you described it. Like, what do you think when you think about changing that approach altogether? Envision, I know you're right about all these constraints, the handcuffs that the Congress and others put on the agency, but in your perfect world, now that you've gone through this period, like what would you want the agency to be like in the future?
Well, lest that quote be taken out of context, let me say that and this isn't lip service, like I really see myself, even though I wasn't a development professional before coming here, I see myself on a continuum here, having taken the baton from Mark Green, who in turn took the baton from Gail Smith, who I worked so closely with for 4 years at the NSC and learned so much from. And of course, she in turn, partnered with Raj from the White House, and then Raj as such an impactful USAID director. Those are just since I've been in government, my kind of USAID lodestars, and they've been great collaborators as well since I've been in this role. What I was talking about, I think, and I don't have the exact context for that quote, is not again some revolution, but it is a mindset shift, I believe, that I was talking about, which is that when you're an organization that is blessed with generous appropriations, as we have been, so I hope continue, because the programmatic work and the project work is so important. There's a temptation to be very, very focused on that and all the compliance requirements and all the reporting requirements associated with that. But what I've tried to do is unleash in the workforce the recognition that they know so much, and they don't just know how to run a program. They actually have really great ideas on what, for example, policy changes a government might make that could have outsized development benefits well beyond anything we might be doing with the Ministry of Education or anything we might be doing with an implementing partner on malaria. And so, with all of this talent and expertise, getting people to see themselves as kind of development diplomats. And one example is that I would offer, just in terms of how this different mindset can manifest itself. I have a deputy mission director in one of our Latin American missions, who I think every 6 months calls the team together and says, "What are our top 3 policy changes that we are looking for from the country in which we are working?" It can be local, it can be, in a governorate, it can be at the national level where it often is. And what is our plan over the next 6 months to leverage all of the programming that we're doing across these sectors to secure those policy changes? And it might be, about whether migrants' kids get to go to school, or whether migrant physicians get to work, in the local hospital, maybe in that domain. Or maybe something about, public financial management that would free up resources to make their own investments in health systems or in clean energy or whatever. And so that's the progress beyond programs. There's the programs themselves, and then there's, when you're looking around in the countries in which you're working, what should the priorities were? Like the question you posed to me, sort of, if you're starting from scratch and you didn't know what your earmarks and your directives were, what do you think USAID or any development community should be best focused on? And when you answer that question and you happen not to have budget that aligns with that, that's not the end of the conversation. That's actually the beginning of the question of who does, who would be able to make investments, or are there policy changes that are in effect free to ask for? And so I think that peripheral vision, that belief that when you're tackling a problem, you should, be on speed dial with the MDBs, down the street. I mean, that's very uneven in terms of USAID missions interaction, even here in Washington.
They live in different worlds. Yeah.
Someone joked, when I came into the job, that he thought that he needed a passport to go across town and enter the World Bank sometimes. And we've really thickened the relationships, which were always there, but now they're there, at multiple levels. Diaspora. I mean, we think about remittances, which we have a new initiative on as well, to make sure that when money goes, that it is, optimally deployed or to move in that direction. But, what the diaspora itself could contribute to, if they felt they could attach to an initiative where their money would be, or their investment would be, would go for good cause, or even for them to deploy themselves. Now that we have virtual work, we're finding ways to use diaspora based in the United States to, for example, help Moldova with its European accession endeavors. That's not something that's costing USAID anything per se. It's not a funding allocation. It's a recognition that there's a community of people that can help us join our partners on the ground in achieving their objectives first and foremost.
I guess you mentioned earlier, it's not necessarily that it was a revolution you were trying to create, but you also talked about the potential for cuts, or at least alluded to them. We might be at that kind of existential moment for this agency, right? I mean, we may be at a moment when the Trump administration, which in the first version asked for 30% cuts, actually gets them or gets something even more. Who knows? So, and one of the things I worry about, I don't know how you feel, is that the agency has had to focus so much on humanitarian response just because of the realities of the world, that if the budget comes down a lot, it will end up being an agency that's mostly about the humanitarian work and not about many things you've wanted to focus on, whether that's democracy or economic growth. I mean, how do you look at this moment? I can imagine people listening might think you sound very sunny, but there's a lot of people really worried about what's going to happen to this agency.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't I'm the last person to be dismissive of, any of those concerns. We have an incoming administration that is very focused on strategic competition with the PRC. It is structurally impossible to compete with the PRC in the military space alone. That's not how the PRC is itself deploying its assets around the world alone. Of course, it is doing that. And there are an awful lot of members of Congress, of course, in both parties, that recognize that. And
But you see USAID as part of that effort? Because I think, often people point to the DFC or to the MCC, which has positioned themselves in that way.
oh,
You
I
really
mean,
think,
absolutely. I look. It's not just I who see the U.S. Agency for International Development as America's ground game in many aspects of our foreign policy. The PRC and the Russian Federation see it that way. And, I've lately been quite public about the significant uptick in disinformation or lie campaigns against USAID, um, fueled by these malign actors or strategic competitors, depending on how you want to look at it, trying to undermine our work, seeing the friendship, seeing the face of America that USAID projects out in the world, and the soft power dividend, which is not transactional, it's not linear, but we've all had that experience around the world of meeting ministers who, had a scholarship back in the day that USAID
sure.
paid for, or who worked on a water project, as their first act of public service, worked with USAID or an implementing partner. So I think we see that they see this, they being the Russian Federation, the PRC, to name a couple heavyweight actors. But that's not the sum total of what USAID does, and we're not interested as a development community in seeing USAID's work entirely instrumentalized in that regard. But we do see the really nefarious, not universally nefarious, but often very nefarious impacts of a model of development that prizes, surveillance, an absence of transparency, that excludes civil society, that brings about colossal debt that, as I was talking about earlier, really impedes what a country can invest in its own social services and its own development objectives. So we have development reasons to want a different model, a model that privileges transparency, democratic empowerment, community engagement, environmental safeguards, and above all, independence. Mark Green called it the journey to self-reliance. The journey to debt distress is the opposite of that, of what we are trying to broker here. So I'm not saying that everyone agrees with me or that this view that I'm articulating is rolling off the tongue of the transition teams, scattered around town, but it has the virtue of being true. And I do think it'll be really important, for the incoming national security team, which will probably, include National Security Advisor, incoming National Security Advisor Waltz, and when confirmed, Secretary of State Rubio, and we'll see who my successor will be. But it will be incumbent on them. They will want the resources to be able to show up in a world that is beneficial in the ways that I've described, but also in more traditional national security terms. This is an incoming administration that was last in office at the height of the pandemic and lived viscerally what it meant to see new variants proliferating and, gaps, very significant gaps in surveillance, testing and vaccination capabilities across sub-Saharan Africa. We address some of those, not all of those, of course, and attention has waned, and it's hard to get people to remember what one wished one would have had done, the last time we faced such a mortal crisis as that one. But I think, again, that traditional national security nexus too is quite obvious to most national security professionals, almost led by those in the defense establishment. And so that's the
Sure.
other piece of this, is they're the ones, as Mattis, famously was the person to coin the phrase about it. But I've seen this over the last 2 decades, just the loudest spokespeople for the development and diplomacy tools in the toolbox come from our defense establishment and from the military.
Yeah, to me, it's a compelling argument, but I guess we'll have to see whether the MAGA wings in the House and now in the Senate, and we'll have to see where because you talked about the first Trump administration, a lot has shifted since then, not least the debt and deficit and the big push to cut overall government budgets. And already there are inklings of people going after this kind of work, right? And suggesting that, suggesting, for example, that USAID is pursuing progressive policies around the world. And so I wonder if that might put it more in the crosshairs. Maybe you want to address that directly. Like when people say this, sure, you've heard it, that USAID has kind of a progressive agenda. What do you say to that?
We believe in progress, that's for sure, and development progress specifically. But, I think that you're right that there's going to be a big scrum and an argument about American foreign policy generally and assistance and its place in the toolbox, in America's toolbox. Again, there are many, many people up on the Hill, and certainly many people across the U.S. government, and many in the incoming team that we know about already who get it and who understand that to show up, requires actually, showing up resourced at the State Department, resourced in terms of the kinds of investments we can make, or we will see others fill the void. So that is, again, a well-backed argument. There are very large numbers of people who
There
believe
are.
that and who've seen it out in the world. There are, of course, some who have a kind of more zero-sum mindset about, well, if you spend it there, it means you're not spending it here, or we lack here, and it must be because we're doing something over there. It is going to be incumbent on those who know the facts to show why, in almost every instance, that is not the case and is a straw man of an argument. There's another, and I've dealt with this in my congressional exchanges.
I've gotten to hear some of
I
those.
don't know I wasn't sure what the noun would be there, but where, like, I think this is maybe a little bit what you're getting at, where there might be, individual members of Congress who pluck out a single program and try to reduce all that USAID is doing in the world, to some particular beneficiary or constituency, in a manner that makes it look, as they put it to me, ideological. They're not going to find a lot of that at USAID, and often, the kinds of things that they play back to me, I'm not even sure that those things are happening. When you're
It's
testifying
been
under oath, you
twisted
don't
in
want to say
some way,
anything
sure.
that's inaccurate. I mean, there's a lot that goes on at USAID. We're a big organization, 14, 15,000 people around the world, programs in 100 countries. So you can't always do the fact checking there on the spot from recall, but this is an agency that fundamentally, over time is helping communities pull themselves out of poverty, strengthen their health systems. In the case of climate and clean energy, I mean, this will be something that will greet the incoming team, because as we see in California, because the effects of extreme weather events are now so catastrophic, it'll be very hard for the new administration to engage with other countries and not hear about the challenges that they are facing, often economically or in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of now new public health challenges and morphing, public health, global health challenges. Uh, that in other words, even those things that may, some may seek to caricature are the daily bread of governance and the daily challenge of public service for so many of our partners around the world. And so, the 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 realities of today are going to drive other countries' priorities for our bilateral engagements, and that too will shape, I presume, over time, maybe not right at the beginning, an understanding of again what it would do for the United States to move away from being the partner of first choice.
I think probably the last time the agency was so much in the crosshairs was the 90s, the Jesse Helms era that some people remember. And back then the big idea was, well, maybe we can merge USAID into the State Department. If that idea were to come back, I mean, we've seen it in Australia and Canada and the UK and lots of other places. If that idea were to come back, how would you respond to that? I mean, what's your feeling about, you talked about the importance of development diplomacy. Is there a world in which USAID could be part of the State Department and that would be an okay thing in your perspective?
Well, I think that the coordination between the State Department and USAID, in general, sort of NSC shared efforts where all agencies are coming together, under one flag for common
Mhm.
purpose is really important. And um, we are at our best when, for example, I was mentioning sort of global health security issues. State Department now, has diplomats who are increasingly specializing, right, in everything from mobilizing, doing their own form of diplomacy globally by trying to mobilize resources around global health security, but also that kind of interface with governments. That's coming more and more from the State Department. And that's to do modern diplomacy in 2025 is going to entail having a fluency, particularly with transnational challenges that, 10, 15, 20 years ago were not in the Foreign Service Institute's manual for how necessarily how diplomats need to be trained before they went out in the world. I think that's really different than, thinking that these are one and the same.
Mhm.
And that coordination is really important because I myself was talking, of course, about America as the ground game, for American foreign policy in many respects, and all the benefits that I think the American people and the national security establishment accrue from us doing our work. But development and humanitarian work that gets entirely instrumentalized, really does risk becoming so transactional and, so much uh, just bounded in a way by shorter term considerations. And if you think about the kind of lasting impacts that USAID and development generally, development efforts have achieved, it's always a long game, right? And you always have to be looking at outcomes from the standpoint actually of what is actually working from the standpoint of expanding girls' literacy, or from the standpoint of electrifying, rural areas that can't connect to the central grid and are going to need to rely on solar or on wind or on other, you have to have those objectives animating your work. And I think, in creating an office of the chief economist here in these last years, and an office of policy, and really trying to be, in part because of the scarcity of resources commensurate to the scale of the challenges, in trying to be, even more rigorous and exacting about how we do our jobs, it is still from the standpoint of what will get you the best buy in terms of a development outcome. If, and I'm not saying a merger would necessarily, cause you to scrap that, but it becomes more likely that the independent set of development objectives across education, health, climate and the environment, food security, it would, I think, pose some peril potentially to seeking to achieve those objectives for their own sake. And while I believe USAID is a major asset for American foreign policy and in strategic competition, I can tell you traveling around the world that the when what we do is seen to be for that reason, it is there is great suspicion that greets it. And I'll give you just one example where on a visit to Nepal, I visited schools that USAID had built after the earthquake and had, equipped with computers and this and that, and did a press conference. And this came on the heels of a very active PRC campaign to try to prevent an MCC compact from going forward. Huge floods of disinformation around what the MCC was trying to do in Nepal. It ultimately went through, but the legacy of all of that money and propaganda and misinformation and falsehoods being out there had a carryover effect on US assistance generally. And so when I went to do this press conference, virtually every question that I was asked, if I remember rightly, was, yeah, but aren't you just doing this because you want to compete with the PRC? Aren't you, this isn't really about the people of Nepal. Like, is it? Didn't you just go to that school and wire that school with that new IT equipment, because of the PRC rather than, because, and I had to say, no, well, actually, we've been here since the 1960s, and the roads to the schools that I was at today were actually built by USAID, decades ago. And that is our superpower, right? Is that recognition that we really are genuine in caring about the welfare of people for their own sake. And that's where localization again comes in, that it and we want to be very authentic as well about taking our cues from those who know best about how they can drive their own development progress. So as we distinguish our model of development and say it's about the journey to self-reliance or making sure that countries can carve their own development paths, we just want to make sure, I think, that we keep our eye on a set of development objectives, even as we recognize, as you said, that we are in a different kind of crosshairs. We are on the playing field at a time when the number of actors making investments and aligning with various objectives, I think, has never been more heterogeneous or complex, but where I still think we and some of our EU and other, and now increasingly Korean and Japanese development partners and Australian development partners, we have a great story to tell and we have great impacts to point to. And we want to make sure that I think, is our lodestar.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's very compelling to me, but I do feel like we're at this moment where a lot could shift. It's sort of it's a very fine line. We're saying we're going to compete with China because we have a different set of values, but we're also going to compete with China. So it's a very fine line. There's a diplomatic and foreign policy goal as well as a long-term development goal. And then here domestically, we just have more pushback than probably we've ever seen. And I think you've tried a lot to shift things at the agency in this period. In fact, I know we're kind of running out of time, but I wanted to at least give you a chance to respond because we in the development community, we get a lot of debate about these topics. And of course, you've probably seen this, but Unlock Aid, they came out with their own piece and they said um, they had a lot of good things to say, but their critique was that this administration showed the right intentions, got a lot of the policies right, but didn't move fast enough to translate those policy changes into tangible results. And they say, it largely tinkered at the margins and can show only incremental gains for their work. You kind of responded to some of that just in listening to you and what you've achieved so far. But I want to give you a chance because I know we're running out of time just to lay it out there for our audience. When you think about your legacy after these 4 years in this role, how do you feel about that? Do you feel like you've done more than incremental change, or is this the sort of thing where had you been in the role for 4 more years, had we had a different result, we would have seen much more really tangible things we could point to? How do you feel about it?
Well, first, I'm not thinking about my legacy, and I'll let others do that. And I mean, I certainly would like to see a steeper trajectory of return on, process investment. But USAID and its performance should not be measured, simply by, the number of the amount of money that's been shifted in this direction or another direction. It should be measured as it is measured by the beneficiaries in the countries in which we work, by the lives changed and the lives touched. And so we haven't even, over the course of, chatting here today, really talked about USAID's work in Ukraine, or, what it means to really have the private sector, you know, in present at the creation as we embark on, some kind of digital transformation. We haven't talked about USAID now for the first time really throwing its weight behind a primary healthcare set of objectives, even though we don't have, again, earmarks or directives that go strictly in that area. We have huge leverage, even if we fund largely by diseases, or, by maternal child health as well, but by TB, by malaria, by COVID, I mean, that gives us great scope to actually encourage or even press ministries of health to make more substantial investments in primary health. I'm just using that as an example. We haven't talked about, what could be, one of the most important development campaigns in our lifetimes, which is the battle to end lead poisoning, where we now have, by 10x increased the amount of resources that are going to be available to countries where 1 in 2 kids right now, or 1 in 3, depending on the country, 1 in 3 of their kids have been poisoned with lead, and that's going to set back educational outcomes. It's going to mean early deaths for very significant numbers of them. And I could go on and on. In other words, we have to look at both the how, and getting that trajectory on a steeper incline, which I think is going to happen in light of the reforms that have occurred. Again, maybe not as steep as any of us
But
would.
you think those will sustain in a Trump administration?
I mean, we'll see. I don't know who my successor is going to be,
Hmm.
but it's not, if you're talking about the how or the what. I mean, the
The how.
how, I'm not sure that they're. I mean, they're um, the question of safeguards, and the question of risk appetite is always something that is going to be difficult. And, if I were outside of government, I would say, well, I might say, just go for it, why not? And I understand that, but the answer to why not is the the fact that we have to be able to represent faithfully that our resources have been accounted for. And that's, again, we talked at the beginning about bureaucratic burdens on our staff, but fundamentally, especially in a charged political environment, the question of what the right balance is on risk appetite is one we have pushed the envelope very far. We have tried to bring Congress along and have a constituency up there, I think now in both parties. And Ukraine helped because people really wanted speed. And so we said, okay, we can give you speed, but that's going to mean, more risk here and there. And we've managed to build out the controls. So, I think people broadly feel that the money has gone where it is intended to go. But, if because there are now people who would sooner, scale back assistance altogether, we just want to be sure that we are going at a pace that allows us simultaneously to absorb more risk, because we know the risk of not moving to more local partnerships, right? We know the risk that our investments are less sustainable if we are just, cycling money through partners who at some point will pull up stakes and leave a country. We know there is risk in that. But that's I know a lot of the groups have been educating people about those risks, the risks of
Hmm.
not localizing for a long time. But, thickening the constituency and having more people who understand that if you only look, at the risk of making it easier to partner with USAID, you will not be doing a proper risk management calculus. And not everyone understands that. And so part of these years has as well has been, yes, about making changes and getting us on a course. And there's like a 2 year lag, I think, between, when our changes kick in and then when you actually see a contract written differently or a grant expended differently. So there's going to be just a time lag no matter what. But I think this effort to grow the constituency is not just about growing it here at USAID. It's fundamentally about on the how about helping those who invest in USAID and support USAID and defend the resources allocated to USAID, that it is better to absorb more risk here on the front end in the interests of making a more lasting difference over time. And we've chipped away at that and made headway on that, but we don't operate in a vacuum in the way that sometimes I think some of the critiques might suggest. But I absolutely embrace the critique that we would like to be going faster, and I hope you'll see that trajectory steepen over time.
And I want to continue this conversation when you are out of office, and maybe, who knows, maybe you will look back and have a different view about this issue of risk. You're so right. It's easy to say it from the outside, and the number of restrictions and challenges that are placed on the people who work across that agency every day trying to do the right thing. It's not easy. It's not easy. I know we've got to go. I just want to throw, oh,
But,
go ahead.
but Raj, let me just say something in defense of those. I mean, as somebody who is about to be on the outside again and who, started her career on the quote outside, it's still essential that that pressure be placed on people like me and
Hmm.
on the agency as a whole, because it's actually the risk of taking excessive risk is so great that the incentives are very hard to align around, shaking things up or around, mobilizing new partnerships and so forth. So I'm in no way saying, easy for you to say, you're out there, it's so much harder to be. I'm really not saying that at all. What I'm saying is because we don't operate in a vacuum, we just need that broad education about risk calculus and risk management to extend, to other quarters. And I know that's what the groups have tried to do, but it's a kind of complex and for some, seen as a slightly weedy issue. And so it doesn't grab people's imagination, the kind of underlying context in the way that it would make it easier to expand that community as quickly as we would like.
You said you don't want to talk about your legacy. You're not thinking about it. So I'm going to ask you about your future. I dug up an old quote you had. You had the great privilege of working as an intern for Mort Abramowitz, the great Mort Abramowitz, I think in your early 20s. And you said about him, unlike many of his colleagues who had emerged from government, he still retained the capacity for surprise. And I guess I want to know, do you still retain that capacity? What can we expect from you going forward now in your last few days in this job?
Um, I definitely retain the capacity for surprise. I think my team would attest that the colored markers circling things and the choice. Um, I guess it's not an acronym when you do a WT something. It's not an acronym, whatever the choice initials. But yeah, I mean, I think you it's a balance, right? You have to have a balance in life between the patience to know that systems change, and that's again on the how, but also impact in the world is it takes time, but the impatience, to never be like, oh, but it takes time. And I try to strike that balance. I think of course, my trips, everyone's trips out in the world, out of Washington, are what bring home, the importance of that work. Have come back from every trip with a to-do list and a self-tasking list and a team tasking list, and just going through and checking and making sure that we've followed through on the commitments that we've made has been really important. But um, I think there is a risk of psychic numbing. There's a risk in our own politics to also numbing to polarization. There's a risk to getting used to climate emergencies of the kind that are devastating so many here in the US right now. And we just can never get used to these kinds of challenges or harms and have to somehow, keep that spirit of, okay, this isn't really working right now, but what can we do to turn it around? Or, how can we think differently? And I think climate, of course, poses the biggest challenge there because I think there's no issue that any of us work on that is more disempowering because it's so big and so beyond what any one actor, even any one country can achieve on its own. But even there, again, I take heart from the people that I've had a chance to meet around the world who are, just putting one foot in front of the other and doing their part. And that's ultimately how the kind of more fundamental change we know we need will come about. So
Yeah, I hear you on that and agree. And it's been great to get a chance to talk with you. Thank you for taking the time. Let's do this again
thank you,
when
Rush.
you're free.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Good to see you.